At exactly 5:49 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, two Russian Air Force Sukhoi Su-27 flanker fighters were cruising at 28,000 feet over international airspace in the Baltic Sea, just 23 nautical miles from Lithuanian territorial waters. The lead pilot, flying a Su-27P variant equipped with an N001 Myech pulse-Doppler radar system capable of tracking targets up to 80 miles away, maintained a steady course of 287 degrees. His wingman held formation 1,200 feet to the right and 500 feet back. Both aircraft carried a standard air superiority loadout, 6 R-27R medium-range missiles with a 50-mile engagement envelope, 4 R-73 short-range infrared-guided missiles, and a GSH 30130mm autocannon loaded with 150 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. The morning sky was clear, visibility unlimited. The pilots were conducting what Russian military doctrine calls a presence patrol, a routine show of force that had been repeated hundreds of times since 2014. Neither pilot knew that 87 miles to the southwest, 4 NATO interceptors had just received authorization to scramble. The alert came at 6:51 a.m. At Šiauliai Air Base in northern Lithuania, 2 German Air Force Eurofighter Typhoons powered up their EJ-200 turbofan engines, each producing 20,250 pounds of thrust in full afterburner. The lead Typhoon, call sign Timber 41, belonged to the Luftwaffe's Tactical Air Force Wing 31. Simultaneously, at Amari Air Base in Estonia, 2 Spanish Air Force F-18 Hornets from the 12th Fighter Wing began their takeoff roll. The response time from alert notification to wheels up, 4 minutes, 38 seconds. This was the Baltic Air Policing Mission in action, a continuous NATO operation that had been running without interruption since March 2004, when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined the alliance but lacked their own fighter aircraft. The 4 NATO jets climbed rapidly, their mission simple: intercept, identify, and escort the Russian fighters away from NATO airspace boundaries. At 6:58 a.m., the German Typhoons reached 32,000 feet and locked their Captor M ESA radars onto the 2 Su-27s. The range readout showed 62 nautical miles, then 58, then 54. The Spanish Hornets were approaching from the east, boxing in the Russian formation. Standard intercept protocol dictated visual identification first, weapons hold unless fired upon. The Typhoon pilots could see the Russian aircraft on their helmet-mounted displays, 2 amber diamonds moving steadily northwest. But something was different this time. At exactly 7:02 a.m., the Russian flight lead did something that violated every established norm of these routine encounters. He turned directly toward the approaching NATO fighters. The Su-27's radar warning receiver was screaming. The pilot knew he was being painted by multiple targeting radars. He knew the NATO jets carried AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles with active radar homing, weapons that could engage from 30 miles away and cruise at Mach 4. He also knew that turning into an intercept was considered an aggressive maneuver, the kind of action that could escalate a routine encounter into an international incident. But his orders were explicit. For the past 6 weeks, Russian military command had authorized a new posture: contest every NATO patrol, make them work for every mile of airspace, demonstrate that the Baltic Sea was not NATO's private lake. The pilot pushed his throttle forward and dove 2,000 feet, accelerating to 580 knots. The German flight lead, Timber 41, immediately radioed the NATO Combined Air Operations Center at Wedum, Germany. Aggressive maneuver by contact, requesting rules of engagement clarification. The response came back in 11 seconds. Weapons tight, maintain visual contact, do not break away. The Typhoon pilot banked hard right, pulling 7.2 Gs, keeping the Su-27 in sight through his canopy. The range was now 12 miles. The Russian wingman had followed his leader into the turn, and both Su-27s were now flying directly at the interception package. This was no longer a routine patrol. This was a game of chicken at 600 miles per hour. At 7:04 a.m., the two formations passed each other with a lateral separation of just 1.3 miles and a vertical separation of 1,800 feet. NATO pilots reported later that they could clearly see the Russian aircraft's external stores, could read the Bort numbers painted on the fuselage, could even see the pilots' helmets through the canopy glass. The closure rate at the merge was 1,140 knots, nearly 13 miles per minute. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The Russian fighters rolled wings level and resumed their original heading. The NATO aircraft turned to follow, settling into loose trail formation 4 miles behind. For the next 37 minutes, the 6 fighters flew in an uneasy parade, the Russians maintaining course, the NATO pilots maintaining their escort, until the Su-27S finally turned east and headed back toward Kaliningrad Oblast, the Russian exclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania. The Spanish Hornets broke off at 7:28 a.m. The German Typhoons maintained visual contact until 7:41 a.m. when the Russian fighters crossed back into Russian-controlled airspace over Kaliningrad. Total intercept duration, 50 minutes. Total international airspace violation, 0. Total shots fired, 0. But something fundamental had shifted. This encounter was logged as Incident Report BAP2-0241847, one of many such scrambles that year alone. The pattern was unmistakable. Russian aircraft were flying closer to NATO borders, turning into intercepts more frequently, testing response times with increasing aggression. What NATO intelligence analysts recognized in the weeks following this encounter was that Russia was mapping the alliance's decision-making process. How long until fighters scrambled? What were their approach vectors? When did weapons go from safe to armed? Every intercept was a data point, every turn a measurement, every radar lock a probe of NATO's tactical reflexes. The Baltic had become a laboratory for testing alliance cohesion, and every routine patrol was now a potential flashpoint. The aircraft that scrambled that morning returned safely to their bases. But the mission they flew and the hundreds like it that would follow represented something larger than a single intercept. They represented the thin line of aircraft and pilots that stands between international norms and their erosion, between routine operations and potential miscalculation. In the skies over the Baltic, where NATO and Russian aircraft pass within miles of each other almost daily, the next intercept is always just minutes away.